you think is next? And who challenges the American strikes on these boats?
That's a good question, and it's very difficult for someone to challenge, these orders or military operations. Perhaps we have a military member refuse to carry out, one of the operations or one of the strikes, and that individual is court-martialed. Perhaps we have one of these individuals that it's targeted survive and taken to court, in which case they might be able to bring up the lawfulness of the strikes. Probably, it may come up in that maybe one of the individuals killed is a dual U.S. Venezuelan citizen or a dual Spanish Venezuelan citizen, and they actually bring a case either in the United States or somewhere else, or their family members bring a case, and maybe it arises that way. But there's no clear, I think, no clear pathway for someone to challenge this in court. I would say, the opportunity that we perhaps had was when we had those two survivors of one of the strikes off the coast of Colombia a few weeks ago, but they were turned back over to, Ecuador and Colombia, respectfully.
Do they still have a case now, even though they're not in U.S. custody? And just for our listeners here, among some of those initial strikes that Todd had mentioned, there were two survivors, and apparently they were held for quite some time on American ships and then released back to their home countries. Do they still have legal standing, and what court do they take this to?
Now, again, I don't think they would have standing in the U.S. federal court, right? And if they tried to bring it in a court in their home country, the U.S. Would assert sovereign immunity, and so I really don't think there's much of a chance that those actions would be challenged. The opportunity would have been had they been brought back to the United States, charged with a federal crime such as material support to terrorism. There's actually a federal law that makes it unlawful to operate a semi-submersible unlicensed vessel, and at least from the media reports, this strike was on a semi-submersible vessel, so probably wouldn't have been a difficult federal criminal case to prove. And maybe that's why they released them. They didn't want these individuals, having access to the media, during their court cases.
Well, what do you think that says about our decision to release them back to their home countries instead of bring them over to the United States to face charges?
No, I think that is, perhaps one of the clear signs that these strikes are on very shaky legal ground or clearly unlawful. Because again, in my time in advising on military operations, in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other places, we would want to have detainees to interrogate, to gain further intelligence, right? That was one of the key elements that would allow U.S. forces to, continue targeting other members of these terrorist networks. And so I would think, and maybe they did on the ships, maybe they interrogated them and got all the intelligence they thought they could. But again, it just seems very odd that they would release these individuals.